interview series. My name is Antje Fiedler, and I'm an associate editor of the Journal of Small Business Management. I have the great honor today to talk with Professor Edward Altman about his research on SME defaults predictors. The research was conducted by him together with his colleagues Marco Balzano, Alessandro Giannozzi, and Stefan Srhoj. Edward is a professor emeritus of finance at the Leonard and Stern School of Business in New York. Welcome, Edward.
Thank you very much, Antje, and I'm delighted to be with you.
Fantastic. So their paper, Revisiting SME Default Predictors, the Omega Score, was published online in November 2022 in the Journal of Small Business Management. And the first question I have is, can you please tell me where the idea for the paper came from?
Well, I'd like to give you the answer to that, but it's a long answer, but I think hopefully interesting to your viewers. So I began my research on predicting financial distress of companies of all sizes, small, medium, and large, about 100 years ago. Actually, not that, but believe it or not, more than 50 years ago, when I published my first work on the Z-score model on bankruptcy prediction. And then in 2003, I had the good fortune of having a visiting scholar at New York University. And he was interested in particularly the small and medium-sized firms. His name is he's Italian, his name is Gabriele Sabato. And Gabriele and I did research and published several articles about SME prediction. It was like the first generation models for small business predicting financial distress. But it was based on publicly available data. So these were all companies that were small, but not too small. And their stocks were listed on the stock exchange, so we could get data. And that began my fascination with small business, how it was different than, say, large companies. Then in 2016, I was asked by the Borsa Italiana, the stock exchange in Italy, to build for them a model that could help investors understand better small companies that issued bonds directly to the public. And those bonds were called mini bonds, small bonds. Actually, there was a more formal name, but it was pioneered by some practitioners, but also the government and the stock exchange. And I asked this fellow, Gabriele Sabato, who was my co-author back in earlier period, would he be interested to work with me? And we built a model specific for small firms in Italy. That model only contained financial data on the companies based on some pretty good databases that were available to us from a small and medium-sized organization based in Italy. And we had data on about 15,000 companies, about 1,000 defaults, and we built models for Borsa Italiana just based on financial data. And it was quite accurate, satisfactory, and they are still using this model to help investors and particularly to stimulate secondary trading of the mini bonds that were being issued and listed on the stock exchange. So my fascination continued with SMEs. Gabriele and I formed a firm based in London called Wiser Funding, and you can check it out on the internet, called wiserfunding.com. And our focus was a global model or models on SME distress and default prediction using a number of methodologies that I had built, but for larger companies. Credit scores, bond rating equivalents, and probability of default. And then, I forget, maybe 2 years ago, I was contacted by my co-authors. Would I be interested in working with them on a new methodology, namely machine learning, and focusing on more than just financial data? Oh, by the way, the wiser funding models also included non-financial data, but not management data. The non-financial data was on governance, mainly boards of directors, and carbon emissions, climate change, and macro data. My co-authors said, would I be interested to work with them? The data was coming from Croatia, as you know, on our article. And it focused not only on financial data, but also on most importantly, new types of variables that were found from their database in Croatia on such things as management change, employee turnover, average tenure, or how long the employees are working for the company, and other management-related variables. Putting it all together in a machine learning algorithm and coming up with our new scoring model called Omega. So the motivation was really a long time coming, with a long time fascination in small business, keeping in mind that we always felt that the data on small businesses was generally not as meaningful because of their being small, maybe not reporting as frequently, and because they're small, they're also not well understood. But we felt from the beginning, even though they're small, you can learn a lot from financial data, and that was the focus of our original research. But then when I was asked to join the research team for this paper, they said, let's focus also on two new aspects. One, not bankruptcy or liquidation as the event, but when a small firm, at least in Croatia, had its financial relationship with banks blocked. So they couldn't do any more transactions because there was some problems in paying their creditors. And that was the event, that is the event that our model is trying to predict 1, 2, and 3 years before the blocking. Could you predict that? And if so, and we'll talk about this, what sort of implications are there for management or for policymakers, et cetera, or for small business associations like the sponsor of your journal. Well, these guys were great to work with. And we think we came up with this new model, the Omega, and we're quite convinced that employee and management variables add to the accuracy of the traditional technique. So that, in a very long way, is motivation and methodology.
Thank you so much, Edward, for that interesting explanation that was really adding to the paper for me. So another question I have for you is, what are the most interesting theoretical takeaways of the paper?
Well, I think I mentioned it somewhat on that, and that is the fact that, particularly in small businesses, but I think in general, when you have changes in management, for example, or lots of company employees leaving and joining. That is a factor that not only the firm needs to understand, but also their suppliers, their creditors, the employees themselves, as to how vulnerable the firm might be to essentially having financial problems. So the main takeaway is that accuracy, and I have some general guidelines, but I would say that the accuracy of failure prediction models in general for small companies is about 60 to 65% financial. I would say 20, 25% non-financial, including governance, as I said before, but also management and in more modern terms, ESG factors. And then finally, small firms operate in macro environments. So for example, we're expecting many more small firms to have financial problems next year, globally. It varies, of course, the country and the sector. So for me, the best models involve financial, non-financial, and macro data. And the non-financial should, if possible, include management variables that before our study were, because the data was not available or nobody thought of it as much. So okay, that's would be the main takeaway of, and also the event that you're trying to predict. It's one thing to talk about an earlier event like blockage of your account, or a more extreme, bankruptcy itself, which usually comes after some intermediary negative event like blocking of the account or missing an interest payment on some payment or having some delays, delinquencies. And while some of these firms never go bankrupt, they could have these temporary problems like liquidity problems in a tough time. It's very important to identify this early enough to make changes. And so that we feel is one of the major contributions of our work.
Fantastic. You already explained at the beginning how your predictions can support investors to make better decisions. And you also talked about the government, but are there any other insights for practitioners and policymakers that you would share?
Well, policymakers, there are various levels. If you're talking about government policymakers, such as small business associations that are operating in different countries, they usually, although there is an international one, I guess, that you're affiliated with, which is, I think, terrific because you can learn a lot from other countries' experience as well as your own, that these models could, not always, but could assist the small firms in their interaction with the creditor community. Let me explain what I mean. Many times, a company that comes to a bank, for example, or a non-bank increasingly, they may or may not know that they are being analyzed by some credit scoring technique of the bank or the non-bank. But they usually don't understand these models very well. And they are told at the end, you are accepted or you're rejected, or your risk is high, so the interest rate is very high. And they are in a very subservient situation. Take it or leave it. Now, if the firms understand better these models, and particularly if they understand the variables that are in the models, they can do something about their own operation to some extent to make themselves look more favorable. I mean, one thing that I hadn't mentioned to you, but I have worked in the past, this is quite a long time ago, with the CEO of a company. And that CEO was brought in when the company was in distress, on the verge of bankruptcy. And he had read my original Z-score model, predictive model. And what he said was really very interesting, and I learned a lot from him. And that was, maybe I can use a bankruptcy prediction model and make changes so that the model will say, I'm no longer looking like I'm going bankrupt. In other words, it was a prescriptive assessment. The company looked really in bad shape when he came in. And every decision he made as CEO or with his senior management team was first simulated into the model as to what the model would say if he made that change, such as selling a division or reducing payroll or selling or liquidating a product line. But before he made that decision, he said, let's do a scenario analysis on the impact on our financial statement and the Z-score. If you have a better model than Z-score, particularly for SMEs, focused on them, then maybe that model could be used, like the Omega score, to help management. But it's important for academics like myself and yourself to be able to communicate in a clear way that the policy prescriptions can be understood even by, let's say, relatively unsophisticated management with respect to scholarly works at small businesses. So as almost a turnaround tool to use models to, in effect, Antje, reverse the prediction. So I've learned a lot from that, and I use that in my lectures with my students and when I do consulting or lectures for practitioners. And they understand that, and they can use that, I feel, in their negotiations with creditors. And that's going to be really important, because typically what happens in a downturn, like an economic recession or very high interest rate or inflation, as we're all now worried about, there could be a credit rationing against small businesses, more so than big ones. And so it's up to the management themselves to convince the creditors or to find other creditors that, hey, we're not so bad. Take a look at our credit score, our Omega score, or our Z score, or whatever you want to model you use, to show that we have a bond rating equivalent, maybe of a, lower investment grade or high non-investment grade company, as opposed to a company on the verge of going bankrupt. So I think that that could be, from a policymaker standpoint, a very important dimension of our research.
It's a really great example to illustrate how management have used your model to communicate better their data to external stakeholders. So thank you for sharing this.
Like I said, I have a table in one of my speeches that lists all the applications of distress prediction models from the standpoint of external analysts to the firm, and then another table from internal. And for example, when I testified in Congress in the United States back in 2008, whether or not General Motors should go bankrupt or not, whether it should be bailed out by the government or not. I used our models to show how bad the situation was, and it needed some radical change. And I felt, interestingly, I'm not so sure it works as well in New Zealand or in Europe or whatever, but it's working very well in the US, and I think internationally now, that you can do major changes more easily in bankruptcy than out of bankruptcy, based on what we call Chapter 11 reorganization. You can get credit much easier if you're in bankruptcy, believe it or not, than not in bankruptcy, through something we call debtor in possession financing. But it's only available if you go bankrupt. It's kind of weird that the company all of a sudden has creditors knocking on their door saying, we'd like to lend you money, but first you have to go bankrupt. And that's what I was testifying. And I used the Z model to show how bad the situation was. I was not very popular with Congress at that time because they didn't want to deal with bankruptcy of such a large American icon company like General Motors. But eventually it happened 6 months later. And today General Motors is a much better company because it went bankrupt, ironically, and restructured.
Fascinating. Thank you. So as we come to the end of our conversation, I ask you maybe as a final question, if you have any further thoughts or comments you would like to share with the community.
Well, only that I'm very interested, excited to have a more formal association with small business journals like the International Journal of Small Business Management that is working, at least from an academic standpoint, and hopefully having practitioners involved as well, to improve the possibilities of small businesses to thrive, because they're so important in so many different countries. You know, maybe more important, certainly more important in Europe than the United States, but still increasingly important everywhere. So if I can play some minor role in that, I'm delighted to try.
Thank you so much, Edward. We really appreciate that you took the time to share these interesting insights with us. I'm sure our readers now want to read the full paper, which is actually freely available at the Taylor and Francis website of the Journal of Small Business Management. So I hope many will read it, and I really thank you again for taking the time.
Thank you very much for your very nice words, and good luck to you and the journal.